And when we started looking at these concepts, we very quickly came to realize that, poverty and inequality can be measured in different ways and may mean different things to different people. But they are very homogeneous concepts compared to mobility. Mobility really means very different things to different people. For a start, sociologists have an understanding of it and have worked on mobility much longer than economists and tend to think of mobility in terms of the occupational changes in the occupational structure of a population, or sometimes the educational structure. But there's a lot to do with occupations and how they define class and movement and those. Economists who sort of started looking at mobility probably in the late 70s is a 1978 paper by Tony Shorrocks, which I think is the first I'm aware of on the measurement of mobility. And from there on, economists have tended to think of mobility as some summary measure of the change in a vector, typically of incomes, but possibly of something else, between one period and the other or going beyond. Okay, so it sounds very simple, but even that idea of changes in a vector can be captured in very different ways. So we highlight three things that we wanted to be very clear about as we present data on Latin America to you. One is, what is the vector? Very often it won't be income. It'll be a measure of educational attainment, like years of schooling, or educational achievement measures, by which I mean test scores typically. It may be incomes or consumption in some period. So the space of mobility matters, and as we'll see, you can have mobility in some spaces without having it in another. Then there's what we call domain of mobility, by which in this case I simply mean the distinction between inter and intra-generational mobility, which are very different things. One is the relationship between the outcomes of your parents and of the children, and the other has to do with changes in the vector of incomes, if you like, over the lifetime of a particular cohort. Even within a particular domain and for a particular space, there are many different ways of measuring it, and they differ more substantially than, say, for inequality, the Gini or the tile. Those are just different ways of aggregating things. But for mobility, it really matters a lot. Gary Fields, who's written a lot on this, part of it with someone called F.A. Oak, sort of thinks of a typology of about 6 concepts of mobility. And I'm a bit of a nerd, measurement nerd, so I could go on at great length about that, but I won't bore you with it. I just want to ask you to think about 3 examples in your heads to highlight how different measures of mobility could make a very big difference. So think of a distribution of incomes that is 1, 10, and 100. Now 3 scenarios. In the first one, that distribution shifts, and I'm keeping the same people, okay? So the order is, Anne, Jack, and Jill, all right? So 1, 10, 100 goes to 2, 20, 200. Scenario A. Scenario B, 1, 10, 100 goes to 100, 10, 1. And scenario C, 1, 10, 100 goes to 36, 37, 38, okay? Now, the first one has a lot of income movement, directional income movement, because if you add up changes in income, there's a lot of it. But there's no rank movement. There's no re-ranking at all. There's no change in the income shares. There's no origin independence. There's no equalization of long-term incomes. In the second one, where there's full rank reversal, right? There are changes in shares and positions, but the measure of directional income movement would register no mobility, because for every dollar that somebody gained, somebody else lost a dollar, right? The average is the same in the end. The third one, there is share movement, for example, but no rank movement. 36, 37, 38 also add up to 111, and there's the shares change, but the ranks didn't. So these are obviously simple little toy examples, but they show you that if you're going to ask the question, what happened to mobility in Argentina during this period, it will matter enormously which concept you're looking at. Different concepts will say very high mobility or very low mobility for the same change. Okay, so after discussing this at some length in the report, we ended up with a 2x2 matrix. You'll find, if you interact with us enough, that World Bank economists are vitiated by profession to end up with 2x2 matrices in whatever we do. 3x3 is already too complicated for us. And that is, on the domain, okay, we want to look at both intergenerational and intragenerational. And of those 6 concepts, we're going to pick 2. One is origin independence, and we're going to focus on origin independence when we look at intergenerational mobility. And the reason is that we think people often, not everybody, but many people tend to think of intergenerational mobility as somewhat related to equality of opportunity. To this idea that how much is your achievement in your life independent from that of your parents? If that's what you want to capture by intergenerational mobility, then the concept you're interested in is origin independence, which is basically the inverse of correlation. Correlation is origin dependence, okay? We're often going to use, instead of the correlation coefficient, the gradient of a regression multiplied by a standard deviation, but the two are not too far away, although they on educational achievement, on attainment, and even earnings in some cases. Within generations, in the intragenerational domain, we could also look at this, but we're going to focus instead on the measure of directional income growth, directional income movement rather, which is really a sort of average of individual growth rates, okay? It's going to turn out for economists to have some nice properties of being an integral under a growth incidence curve and being decomposable. And that decomposability would be nice for us because we are also looking at middle class in this report. So one thing we can do with that measure is we can separate out and decompose a number into movements between the poor and the middle class and other classes that we're going to be looking at. And so that'll be of interest to us. But you should remember when I'm talking about mobility within generations and like, that's the concept I'm using. So if you're really looking for rank movement, that's not what I'm going to be picking up. Okay? That's an important caveat.